Got a jerk arrested for driving on a suspended license after he ruined our night at the billiards club. This story takes me back to the mid-2000s, almost 20 years ago. It was a simpler time in many ways, and for my friends and me, Friday nights were sacred. We had our rituals, and one of them involved heading to a modest little billiards club in Los Angeles. Not the Hollywood kind with glitz and glamour. This place had more grit than gloss, with dim lighting, scratched tables, and regulars who had probably been there since the 80s. But that's what made it special. It was unpretentious, welcoming, and, most importantly, it was ours. Every week, we'd rent a table, sip some cheap beers, and shoot pool for hours. It was our way of unwinding after a week in the grind of the city. For months, it was our safe haven, until one night, when a smug, arrogant jerk shattered that peace and inadvertently set himself up for a fall he'd never forget. The night started like any other. We arrived at the club just past 9 p.m., greeted by the familiar sounds of pool balls cracking, the low murmur of conversation, and the faint strains of an old rock song humming from the jukebox. The place was lively but not overcrowded, the perfect vibe for a night of billiards. We had just finished a game at our usual table and were hanging out at the bar, chatting about the week while waiting for our next turn. That's when he walked in. This guy had trouble written all over him. He was tall, mid-30s, with an air of entitlement that was almost palpable. His leather jacket was scuffed just enough to make you wonder if he was trying to look tough or if he genuinely didn't care. The way he moved, the smug smirk plastered on his face, it was like he wanted everyone to know he thought he was better than them. Without even a glance in our direction, he strolled straight to the table we had just vacated, grabbed a cue, and started playing. No acknowledgement, no "Hey, is this table free?" Nothing. It was like we didn't exist. My friends and I exchanged looks but decided to let it slide. Maybe he didn't realize we were waiting for our next turn. 20 minutes later, it became clear he knew exactly what he was doing. My buddy James, ever the diplomatic one, walked over and said, "Hey man, just letting you know, we're next on this table." The guy didn't even bother to look up from his shot. Yeah, he muttered, waving James off like he was an annoying insect. That's when the irritation started simmering. Still, we kept our cool. Maybe he'd finish his game and move on. Spoiler alert, he didn't. Another 20 minutes passed, and he was still at it, showing no sign of wrapping up. At this point, I decided to step in. "Hey, just a heads up, we're up next on this table," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. His response? A lazy shrug, followed by a smirk that made my blood boil. Then, as if to pour salt in the wound, a woman nearby chimed in, saying she'd called the game after us. He ignored her too, acting like we were all beneath his notice. The sheer audacity of this guy was unbelievable. But the worst was yet to come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he left the table, or so we thought. My friends and I wasted no time reclaiming it. We popped in our quarters, racked the balls, and got ready to play. But as we lined up our shots, we noticed something was missing. The green 6 ball wasn't on the table. We looked around, confused, until one of my friends pointed toward the bathroom. "He's got it," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Sure enough, the guy had taken the ball with him. Who does that? What kind of petty, juvenile move was this? We flagged down the manager, hoping he'd kick the guy out. Instead, the manager sighed like he'd seen this kind of nonsense before and handed us a replacement ball. "It's close to last call," he muttered. "I don't want to make a scene." Disappointed but determined not to let this ruin our night, we tried to focus on our game. But the guy wasn't done. He emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, holding the stolen ball in plain view. His smirk was back, even more infuriating than before. He strolled out to the patio, beer in one hand, the green ball in the other, and lit a cigarette. He leaned back in his chair, looking completely at ease, like he hadn't just disrupted everyone's night. We tried to ignore him, but it was impossible. Every time we glanced his way, he'd look back at us with that smug, self-satisfied grin. It was like he was daring us to do something. And then, for his grand finale, he came back inside, casually tossed the ball onto our table, scattering the game we were in the middle of, and headed to the bar for one last drink. By now, even the regulars were watching him, some shaking their heads in disgust, others clearly amused by the drama. That's when James had the idea that would turn the night around. "What if we call the cops and report him as a drunk driver?" he whispered, his eyes glinting with mischief. At first, we laughed. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad comedy. But the more we thought about it, the more it made sense. The guy had been drinking all night, and he was obviously planning to drive home. Why not let karma catch up with him? 3 of us were immediately on board. The 4th friend, ever the voice of reason, hesitated but eventually agreed to trail him. When he finally staggered out to his car, a battered silver sedan that matched his energy perfectly, we followed at a safe distance. Using our trusty old Nextel push-to-talk phones, we coordinated like amateur spies. Each of us called the highway patrol separately, describing the same silver car, the same erratic driving, and the same near misses with other vehicles. We didn't have to embellish much. The guy was swerving between lanes, barely staying within the lines. We kept our distance, careful not to get too close, but close enough to keep track of his route. It didn't take long for the cops to step in. About 15 minutes after he left the bar, our friend who was trailing him called us, barely able to contain his excitement. "They got him," he practically shouted. A police car had pulled in between their vehicles, lights flashing, and the guy was being pulled over. We didn't stick around to watch the full aftermath, but the next morning, the local police blotter confirmed what we had hoped: the guy had been arrested. Not for a DUI, though. Turns out he was driving on a suspended license. The irony was almost too sweet. Here was a guy who had spent the entire night acting like he was untouchable, only to end up in handcuffs. In the end, it wasn't just about revenge, it was about restoring balance. The guy had strutted into our little haven, disrupted everyone's night, and treated us all like garbage. But that night, karma worked overtime. And for us? We got the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, the universe has a funny way of settling the score. TLDR, a smug jerk at a Los Angeles billiards club stole our table, a billiard ball, and ruined our game. We reported him as a drunk driver, and the cops arrested him for driving on a suspended license. Sweet, sweet karma. The satisfaction of hearing that the guy had been arrested was nothing short of euphoric. After everything he'd done to ruin our night, this was the poetic justice we hadn't even dared to dream of. But as we sat in our cars, buzzing with adrenaline and recounting the events that had just unfolded, the realization of how perfectly the plan had worked started to sink in. This wasn't just some petty revenge scheme, it was a masterstroke of teamwork and karmic retribution. After the call confirming his arrest, we regrouped at a nearby diner, one of those late-night staples in LA where the coffee is passable, the pancakes are always a good idea, and the neon open 24 hours sign feels like a beacon for the night owls of the city. We slid into a booth, still giddy with the energy of what had just happened. "Did you see the look on his face when the cops pulled up?" James said, shaking his head as he laughed. None of us had, of course, but we all imagined it vividly, a mix of confusion, indignation, and the dawning realization that his night was about to take a serious nosedive. "Do you think he had any idea it was us?" one of my friends asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and mischief. We doubted it. He was too self-absorbed, too caught up in his own little world to even consider that the people he dismissed and disrespected all night had orchestrated his downfall. And even if he did suspect, what could he do? We hadn't lied to the police. Everything we reported, the erratic driving, the swerving, the near misses, was true. He'd handed us the ammunition himself. As the hours ticked on, we couldn't help but keep talking about it. Every detail of the night was replayed, analyzed, and embellished with the kind of dramatic flair that only comes with hindsight and a couple of late-night milkshakes. "Remember how he just walked out with the green ball? And the way he smirked at us, like he thought he was untouchable. It was cathartic, venting all the frustration we'd felt in the moment and realizing just how perfectly everything had come together in the end. The next few times we went back to the billiards club, the story became something of a legend. The regulars had all seen the drama unfold, and while they didn't know the full extent of our involvement, they definitely noticed that the arrogant guy from that night wasn't around anymore. "Guess he finally got what was coming to him," one of the bartenders said with a grin when we casually asked about him. We didn't elaborate, of course, just nodded and smiled, letting the satisfaction settle in. Looking back, the whole thing felt like one of those rare moments when everything aligns perfectly. The guy had been a thorn in everyone's side all night, treating people like garbage, and yet he managed to dig his own grave without even realizing it. We didn't have to resort to shouting matches or confrontations, we just let the natural order of the universe take care of things. And the fact that it ended with him being arrested for something as ironic as driving on a suspended license? Chef's kiss. Even now, years later, it's a story we still tell. It's become part of our group lore, a reminder that sometimes, justice isn't just served, it's delivered with a side of poetic irony. Whenever I think back to that night, I can't help but smile. Not just because we managed to turn an infuriating experience into a satisfying victory, but because it proved that even in the chaos of a city like LA, karma has a way of finding its mark. TLDR, smug jerk at a Los Angeles billiards club spent the night ruining games and acting untouchable, so we called the cops on him as a suspected drunk driver. He got pulled over and arrested for driving on a suspended license. Justice served. Over the years, that night became one of those stories you tell to new friends to break the ice, the kind of tale that makes people laugh and shake their heads in disbelief. It wasn't just about the revenge, it was about how perfectly everything had come together. The smirk on his face when he walked into that club had been wiped away by the flashing red and blue lights of a police car. In the grand scheme of things, it might have been a small victory, but to us, it felt monumental. Occasionally, I found myself wondering what happened to him after that night. Did he spend the night in jail? Was the arrest a wake-up call that made him change his ways, or did he keep going through life with the same arrogant attitude? Part of me liked to imagine him sitting in a holding cell, replaying the events of the night in his head, slowly piecing together that his behavior had led to his downfall. The thought was oddly satisfying. We never saw him again at the billiards club, and honestly, that was for the best. The place went back to being our little haven, a corner of LA where we could escape the chaos of the city. Every time we played at our usual table, someone would inevitably bring up the story. "Remember when that guy thought he could just take over our spot?" someone would say, and we'd all laugh, the memory still fresh even years later. But the impact of that night didn't just stop at our group. The regulars at the club, the bartenders, even the manager, all of them seemed a little more on edge about who they let bend the rules after that. It was like our experience had set a precedent. If you're going to act like a jerk, there might be consequences. The club didn't exactly turn into a model of decorum overnight, but there was definitely less tolerance for the kind of behavior that guy had displayed. As for us, the experience bonded our group in a way that nothing else could. We'd always been close, but that night turned us into a team. The way we had coordinated our calls, tailed the guy, and celebrated our victory afterward, it felt like something out of a movie. Whenever one of us was having a bad day, someone would inevitably bring it up. "Hey, at least you're not the guy who got himself arrested over a billiard ball." It never failed to get a laugh. A few years after the incident, the club shut down. It wasn't a big surprise. LA is notorious for constantly reinventing itself, and small businesses like that billiards club often don't last. A trendy cocktail bar took its place, the kind with $15 drinks and a dress code that would have made the regulars from the old days roll their eyes. We went once, just out of curiosity, but it wasn't the same. The charm was gone, replaced by sleek furniture and overpriced snacks. Still, standing there in what used to be our spot, I couldn't help but smile as I remembered that night. Even now, almost 2 decades later, the story lives on. Whenever I tell it, people's reactions are the same, a mix of shock, laughter, and admiration for how we handled it. "You really called the cops on him?" they'll ask, wide-eyed. And I'll shrug and say, well, he had it coming. Because he did. He absolutely did. The funny thing about revenge is that it often gets a bad rep. People think it's petty or that it lowers you to the level of the person who wronged you. But sometimes, revenge isn't about stooping to their level, it's about holding up a mirror and letting them see the consequences of their actions. That's what we did that night. We didn't yell or start a fight, we just let karma run its course. And in the end, it was so much more satisfying than any confrontation could have been. Now, every time I walk into a bar or a pool hall and see someone acting like they own the place, I can't help but think of that guy. I wonder if he ever tells his side of the story, if he even remembers it, or if it's just one of many nights he'd rather forget. Either way, it doesn't really matter. For us, that night was unforgettable, a reminder that sometimes, in the chaos of life, justice has a way of finding the people who deserve it most. TLDR, a smug jerk at a Los Angeles billiards club ruined our night by hogging the table, stealing a billiard ball, and being obnoxious. We reported him as a drunk driver, and the cops arrested him for driving on a suspended license. The ultimate team effort and a satisfying dose of karma.